Guys. This is the first video of our second unit, which is cells. I'm really excited. It's one of my favorite things to teach about, so I hope that you love it. In this video, I'm just going to kind of give an overview of some different examples of cells for you to see, and then also talk about the organelles, which probably will be a little bit of a review for a lot of you, but hopefully you'll learn something new. So here we go. The first thing I want to make sure that I talk about when we start this unit is that cells do not all look the way that you probably have seen them look in like seventh grade, where it's a circle if it's an animal, or it's a square if it's a plant, and inside it always has the same things. And it looks like always kind of the same. That's not really how cells are. So what I wanted to do to start was show you some different cells that are actually real cells and talk about them. So in this picture, or these pictures, these are all individual cells, but they're all different structures and then of course different functions. That kind of goes with what we just talked about in our last unit about how the shape of something really determines the job that it does and its ability to work. So I'm just going to kind of go through these cells and talk about what they are, because this is the kind of stuff that really gets me excited. This picture here is a 3D model, but it is an accurate representation of what these actually look like. This is a white blood cell. And white blood cells have these special structures sticking off of them. These do. There's many types of white blood cells, but this is just one example. And so these are antibodies, which we just talked about a little bit in our last unit, are proteins that are able to actually like protect you from illness. So that's a white blood cell. They're pretty big cells in your body. I'm going to go down in this way. So now these guys are red blood cells. They're actually a lot smaller than the white blood cells, even though they don't really look like this. They're smaller in this picture. It's just blown up a little bit bigger. But they are super small and flexible. They actually don't even have a nucleus. And so they are small and flexible because they have to be able to fit through tiny, tiny, tiny blood vessels in your body called capillaries. You have tiny blood vessels in your eyes and other parts of your body that are only one blood cell thick, so like a tiny, tiny tunnel that the red blood cells have to pass through because they're carrying oxygen. So all the parts of your body have to be able to get that. Maybe you didn't know this, but your blood in your body is in tubes, blood vessels. So it's not just like floating around freely. That's why they have to be small to fit through these like tiny, tiny capillaries. That's red blood cells. Okay, this one is not actually a human cell, hopefully. It's a bacteria. So this is extra small. It has these tails on the ends of them that are called flagella that are used for movement. And they're really, 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 really tiny. So way tinier than even like a red blood cell is. And they have almost no parts besides like DNA and the ability to make proteins. That's a bacteria. So that's a really small cell. Now let's look at this really big cell. These are neurons or nerve cells. So why they're branched like this is so that they can actually send messages all around your body. These branches are called dendrites, and they connect to other neurons. Um, Neurons are some of the biggest cells in your body. The only cells that are bigger than them are egg cells, and those are only in females. So, um, if you're male, neurons are the largest cells of your body. And they're obviously super important because they are the way that you feel everything and and do everything. So there you go. Next is a muscle cell. So this muscle cell is made of tons of protein fibers that actually allow the muscle to contract and expand. So every time you're moving, breathing, being alive, these muscle fibers are able to do that. A cool thing about muscle cells is that they actually have more than one nucleus. So you can see like one here at the top and one down at the bottom, and then one also like here in the middle. And that allows them to contract in different areas at different times. All right, moving up here, this is an amoeba, which is actually a whole organism, but it's also only one cell. So amoebas are pretty cool because they have these structures called pseudopods that engulf whatever they're trying to eat. So in this situation, this amoeba is like eating this thing, smaller like particle or maybe cell. And it's doing that by wrapping its pseudopods around that thing. And then eventually they'll actually connect and trap the whatever it was eating inside of the amoeba. And then it'll be like broken down with enzymes. That's an amoeba. It's alive all by itself, and it's also only one cell. These cells are in plants, and they're called guard cells. So what they do is they actually allow oxygen to be released from the plant because that's what plants produce is oxygen. So these are found in the underside of leaves, but this structure right here is where two guard cells actually come together. It's called a stomate. And it releases oxygen and water. They're able to like maintain homeostasis in plants really well. And finally, we've circled back around to this one, which you can tell like doesn't look quite like the others, and it's actually a cancer cell. So this is a breast cancer cell. So we'll talk more about cancer later this fall, but it's it's a disease that is caused by your own cells acting in a way that they're not supposed to act. So in this picture, this cell has grown these like protrusions that it isn't supposed to have. Um, and cancer at its root is really just cells that are duplicating themselves out of control. So that's what a tumor is, just a clump of cells that kept replicating itself but shouldn't have really been there. And we'll talk about it later too. So if I zoom out just to show you all these cells again, these are all cells. None of them look like the seventh grade circle cell because that's not what cells really look like. So I want you to kind of get that into your mind at the start of this unit. Now, of course, I'm about to show you the like seventh grade circle cell so that we can talk about the parts. But keep this in your mind that cells don't actually look like that. Okay. Now, if we scroll down, we're going to talk about the parts of cells. So all cells are made of organelles, which we can think of as like tiny organs. And they have specific jobs. Now, the other thing I'm going to make sure I say is that not every cell has every organelle. And depending on the job of the cell, it might have really different numbers of specific organelles. So a cell that needs to produce a lot of energy is going to have different organelles than a cell that needs to store a lot of materials. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So if you come down here, you have this 7th grade cell diagram that I've drawn for you, and we're going to just go through it and label the different cell parts. So we're going to start by talking about this line going around the outside, which is the cell membrane. This is cell membrane. It can also be called the plasma membrane. The function of the cell membrane is to maintain homeostasis by controlling what enters and exits the cell. Every single cell that has ever existed has had a cell membrane. They all have one. We'll talk more about it next week. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I want to talk about is the nucleus. So I'm going to come down here to talk about that. So here's the nucleus. Not every cell has a nucleus, but a lot of them do. And the nucleus is where the DNA is contained. Contains DNA. So it's really like the control center of the cell. In the picture, these red squiggles are the DNA. And then there's also a pink section inside the nucleus called the and the nucleolus is responsible for producing ribosome, which I'll talk about next. So one other kind of interesting thing about the nucleus is that it will literally break down during mitosis, which is when the cell duplicates itself so that the DNA can get out and be split up into 2 separate cells. So since I just talked about ribosomes, I'm going to go to ribosomes next. So these yellow dots over here are called ribosomes. Every cell contains ribosomes. And they can either be free floating or attached to another organelle that I'm going to talk about next. Their job is to produce proteins. And if they are free, like this one I just drew an arrow to, it means the proteins made will be used in that cell. Now, the other ribosomes that are over here attached to this blue squiggle, we call them free ribosomes. I'm sorry, bound ribosomes. They're bound. The ones I just labeled are free. So I'm going to label that blue thing next. So this blue section over here is called the endoplasmic reticulum. You can always just call it the ER instead. There are 2 types of endoplasmic reticulum. So if I look up here at the picture, There's some that has ribosomes and there's some that doesn't. And if it has ribosomes, it's called rough ER. And if it's rough, it has ribosomes. Okay. And it makes proteins that will be sent out of the cell. The other option is further away from the nucleus in the picture, and it's called smooth ER. And this has no ribosomes. Its job is to detoxify the cell and produce lipids, so fats. So some cells are going to have a lot more rough ER than smooth ER, and some the other way around. Just depends on the function of the cell. Okay, so from here, we're going to go, let's keep moving around and we'll talk about mitochondria. This purple thing right here, the squiggle, is called a mitochondria. It's the one most people remember most often. Its job is to produce energy for the cell through cellular respiration. Which is a process we'll talk about a lot more later on. One interesting thing about mitochondria is that it has two membranes, which is why I drew that double line. And the reason it has two membranes, scientists believe, is that it used to be actually a bacteria. Like millions of years ago, mitochondria were bacteria, and they were eaten by a larger cell, but just continued to live inside the larger cell. So what's cool about mitochondria too is that they actually have their own DNA. And all the mitochondria that you have now are descended from your mother's mitochondria. Because when the sperm and egg come together to make a human embryo, all the mitochondria in the embryo came from the egg cell on the mother's side. So scientists have actually like traced back mitochondrial DNA all the way back to like the first woman who they call mitochondrial Eve because of Adam and Eve, which is just like a pretty cool thing. That's mitochondria. Okay, let's go up here. So I drew a green circle here and put trash in it to show that there is trash inside of it. These organelles are called lysosomes. Switch to a smaller lysosome. Lysosomes are responsible for waste disposal or breaking down damaged cell parts and recycling them. It does this using enzymes. So I'll say contains digestive enzymes. So if, for example, a mitochondria wasn't doing its job correctly or was damaged, a lysosome could break it down and recycle the parts to build a new mitochondria. Okay, moving up, go around cell membrane here. So these dark blue structures are both the same thing. There's just two different types of them. They're called vacuoles. Vacuoles are of materials. Um, I'm going to say over here have a very central vacuole, which I'll draw in a second. But basically, vacuoles are just responsible for storing things that will be used later. Okay, we just have one more that I want to talk about, and it is called a Golgi body or Golgi apparatus. The Golgi is kind of like the post office of the cell. So it's responsible for proteins from rough ER and packing them to ship out of them. Okay. And when they pack them up, they pack them into these little structures. So this came from the Golgi. It's going to leave the cell. This came from here. This is called a vesicle, which is just a small sac that will leave the cell. So it's almost like a little spaceship that will like travel to the plasma membrane, leave the cell, and go to wherever its destination was, maybe another cell or maybe the bloodstream. Okay, so those are the basic organelles, but I do want to talk about one more that's only found in plants. So I put it down here or over here. Where is it? Where are you? There he is. All right, so this guy didn't get into the cell because the cell I drew looked more like an animal cell. This is a chloroplast. Chloroplasts are only in plants. And more specifically, they're only in the leaves because their function is photosynthesis. Inside of them, they have these like stacked up structures called thylakoids, which we'll talk about later on when we talk about photosynthesis. And also a double membrane, just like the mitochondria. So they also probably used to be bacteria that were engulfed by a larger cell. And they have their own DNA too, which is kind of cool. And I'll just make a note here that plants also have cell walls outside of their cell membrane. And I already mentioned the vacuole. So plant cells have chloroplasts if they're leaves, cell walls, no matter what type of plant part they are, and large central vacuoles. That's the difference between plants and animals. Okay, cool. Thanks for watching. I hope this was a nice little refresher / intro to cells for you, and I will see you soon. Bye.